Every aspect of a game affects the player's experience. Of course, this is audio, graphics, music, things like that. But there's also some more subtle things. For example, as Mark Brown says,
You see, because players knew that if they died, they'd only lose a couple minutes of progress, they would just waltz around the space station without a care in the world. Not ideal in a horror game.
thank you, Mark. That was for a horror game though. How would that look like in a puzzle game? Specifically in this puzzle game. I made Konkan Coast Pirate Solutions. It's a cozy puzzle game about helping pirate ships do pirate things. It's on Steam now. Here are some of the things that I learned while making this game. Spoiler warning. In this section of the video, we will be spoiling the tutorial stages, the early game mechanics, and some of the early game levels. If you'd like to go into the game completely fresh, you should probably click away right now. This is what a puzzle in the game looks like. The dark ships are pirate ships, and we want them to get safely to the dark zones, which are the ports. And the white and gold ships are merchant ships, which we want to trick into going to the white zones where they can get ambushed and then make sure that they reach off the map safely. The ships, the zones, and the land are all fixed as a part of the puzzle. What you can control are these command tokens. These can be placed anywhere on the map, but they can only be placed before the simulation starts. Once the simulation starts, the ships will move forward one grid at a time until either the simulation fails or the simulation succeeds. When a ship reaches a command, it will pick up that command and follow the instruction, in this case turn right. And if it comes to a second command, then it will pick up the new command and drop the command that it was holding. And finally, when a ship sees another ship right in front of it, it will start following that other ship. And that's it. Those are most of the mechanics. KCPS falls under the category of games I like to call set up and play. Because first, we set up the board, then we hit play. There are a lot of games within this genre, and they're mostly on either programming games or puzzle games. In most cases, you'll find that these games have three controls: start simulation, change speed, and reset. So if something goes wrong in your simulation, or you want to carefully observe one part of it, you have to keep going back to the start and then waiting for the simulation to reach the stage that you want to observe. What needs observation might be a set of interactions that follow each other very fast, or it might be the case where you have two interactions happening at the same time in different parts of the board. In KCPS, we deal with this by adding a few more controls. Along with play, we also have pause, as well as an ability to step one step forward and one step back. This means that if something strange happens, which we don't understand, we can always pause, rewind to that point, and then make sure we clearly understand what is happening. Also, since we can use the step forward, we can also hold down that control, which allows us to more quickly navigate up and down the simulation. Both these sets of controls hint at very different ways of playing the game. When you have the three controls, that hints at a much more thoughtful approach. Players are encouraged to work out the entirety of the simulation in their head and then lay out the commands and let it play out. This encourages them to get a much deeper understanding of the simulation as a whole. One drawback is that this approach might lead to a lot of chaos and confusion. The players are not given the tools to thoroughly explore a given interaction, and that might lead to them not understanding things as well as they need to. The 6 controls hint at a much more experimental approach. The players are encouraged to experiment and try out different combinations and see how they work together. This means that the player spends a lot more time in the simulation, and that might help them to understand the puzzle being presented. The drawback to this approach is that players are now free to brute force their solutions rather than deeply understanding the mechanics. The main theme of KCPS is about the joy of exploration of systems. The 6 controls approach does a better job in highlighting this theme. Many times we blindly copy what other games in the genre are doing. I think being deeply intentional about this aspect allowed KCPS to be a better game. In a GDC talk about the game Kine, the developer Gwen Frey talked about something that really changed how I think about this player experience concept. The way that Kine is structured, at most points in the game, the player can choose from multiple levels. But after completing one level, the game automatically throws the player into the next level. This has a huge subconscious impact on the player. When automatically thrown into a level, there is a lot of friction to leave and try another level. Subconsciously, the players either feel that they should complete the level that they have been put into, or exiting and trying something else feels too much like giving up. On the other hand, when players have multiple levels to choose from and they enter one, this psychological baggage does not exist in the same way, and there is much less friction in giving up and trying something else. It was a very small part of the talk, but it really gave me a new appreciation for these subtler aspects of experience design. In KCPS, on level completion, the player is not taken to the next level. In fact, we take this concept one step further. On level completion, the game does not even exit back to the overworld. Instead, it rewinds the level back to its starting point. Many playtesters have complained about this, but I think it's a very important feature. By the very nature of the game, it is possible, and sometimes even likely, that you complete a level completely by accident. Often players just lay out the tokens semi-haphazardly and hit play. Then the level plays out and it turns out that that was the correct solution. In earlier versions, the game would just take the player back to the level select screen, and often the player also realizes that they are not completely sure why the solution works. Sometimes they would go back to the level, play it out and make sure they understand the mechanic being presented, but sometimes they wouldn't. They'd just move on to the next level and go on with the game, possibly not understanding some key interaction. That's why that change was made. When you complete a level, it gets fully reset. Now, there is close to no friction to replay the level and step through the interactions, while exiting the level requires you to move the mouse all the way across the screen. The game is asking the player to subconsciously verify that they have understood what has happened and how, and they do so by choosing to exit the level. This is a bit annoying in the first few levels where a replay isn't required, but very soon more complex interactions are introduced where you have to understand exactly what happened. And the playtests show that players will end up checking why their solutions worked and only quit the level after that point. Also, some players just like to watch the solutions run again. Some levels have really satisfying movements and those can be fun to rewatch. It's hard to overstate just how powerful these subconscious signals and hints are. And as a designer, you need to understand what signals your game is giving and whether those are aligned with your vision. Tutorials. Originally, KCPS had an explicit tutorial. Given the presentation of the game, the idea was that the sim engine as a tool would come along with an instruction booklet of some sort, which would also give an additional method of world building. The issue was that I couldn't figure out what should be in the tutorial. The basics of only being able to control placement of commands and that this can only be done before the start of the simulation, these turned out to be easy enough to grasp without being need to be told explicitly. After that, the addition of the command pickup rules or the following rules were all meant to be discovered, and adding any one of those to the tutorial would mean that the others would also have to be added, and at some point all that joy of discovery would be lost. There are a few issues with this kind of explicit tutorialization. You take these abstract interactions and are forced to put them into words. There is something about our brains that are better at understanding the abstract in an abstract manner rather than being forced to think of them as words. Also, at times it may be hard to differentiate which mechanics are explicit and need to be tutorialized and which are actually emergent interactions. Putting an emergent interaction into the rulebook may rob a player from the opportunity of discovering that. And finally, once you write about the mechanic, once the player reads it, they will know about it in full detail. A lot of the joy of puzzle games comes from those moments where you test your understanding of the mechanics as you know them and verify or disprove that understanding. Explicitly stating this robs the player of more moments of joy. All these things, along with the fact that the game was meant to be all about the inherent joy of exploring systems, meant that I ended up removing my precious instruction booklet. Now that the tutorial text was gone, I still needed to design the tutorial levels themselves. In many games, these tutorials are presented as levels where you are forced to find the mechanic so that you can solve the level. I came up with a slightly different approach. In KCPS, the tutorial levels are designed to lead the player to accidentally discover the mechanic. the player tries out something thinking that it will not work, but it actually ends up working. I think this works well, especially given the style of game. Additionally, all the tutorial levels are presented in a separate group in the overworld, which players tend to naturally understand. This ended up working really well, as most players now go into the rest of the game with an understanding that they have been taught all the mechanics and now they have to use what they have learned to solve the rest of the levels. Progression. Progression means new mechanics, which are super exciting to explore, so it acts as a huge motivating factor for the player. In this game, you progress by completing enough levels in a stage. Choosing that number can be very important. In the tutorial stage, you have to solve all the levels to progress. Each level is meant to explicitly teach something specific. Once you enter the main game, however, this choice has more of an impact. One choice is requiring all levels to be completed, or a very high number. Some great puzzle games do this. It signals to the player that each level has something important that still needs to be learned, or that you have to prove your solving skills by getting fully familiar with the mechanics, with the implication that the next stages will heavily build on them. The drawbacks to this is that it might heavily increase difficulty. Players may be stuck with needing only one more level to progress, and for whatever reason they're unable to solve it, and now they're stuck with no real way of moving forward. Another drawback is that it might get boring. If as a player, I feel like I have understood all the mechanics and interactions, then unless the levels are presenting things that are tangibly unique, it just feels like a chore to get through. On the other hand, you can decide that the players need to complete a very small number of levels. This leads to an overall easier flow where players can decide whether they want to complete extra levels. In most cases, in early worlds, they will clear more extra levels, but in later worlds, they will not. There are drawbacks to this approach as well. Firstly, there is a chance that a player misses out on some important interaction and then gets stuck at a later point. Ideally, this should be spotted in playtesting, and you can change orderings and other aspects to address this. Secondly, since players are more likely to not complete every level, there is a risk that they might end up missing out on levels that they would have actually really enjoyed, and thus again you rob them of that joy. I made the decision to have a very lenient requirement. The main reason is that along the main part of the game, late game levels rarely require the nitty-gritty of earlier game mechanics. They are generally more focused on the newest mechanics being introduced, so a basic understanding of earlier mechanics is enough. I think that the new mechanics are also very interesting, and I've explored them in a way so as to keep the complexity and difficulty to a minimum. So I want as many players as possible to have a chance to check them out. One of the main themes of the game is supposed to be about the joy of exploration of systems. So hopefully, if I've done a good job on that front, players will eventually come back and try out all the levels they may have skipped on their first playthrough. It always comes down to the experience that you're trying to create, and for what I was trying to do, I think I have made the best decision. Spoiler warning, for the rest of the video, we will be talking about the game from a much higher level. I may not be spoiling much in terms of later game mechanics or levels, but we will be discussing a lot of other aspects, and those might have an effect on your experience of the game. Language, context, and difficulty. I don't really like the word language here, but it's the best I got for now. As a game designer, you're always in communication with the player. Each puzzle, mechanic, and interaction teaches them a little bit more about the language of the game. For example, from the tutorial levels alone, there are a few things that have been communicated. Each puzzle is solvable, every command needs to be used in every level. Sometimes levels will have a way of sorting themselves out. So the player is learning that if they think they already have the solution and there is an extra command in the shelf, maybe just whack it onto one of the ships and see if that does the trick. Another thing that the player is getting an intuition for is what is the active play area for a given level. Based on the ships, zones, land, the player is slowly building up that intuition. In any particular level, the commands are most likely to go in a very small number of spots, and the player is getting an intuition for how to spot those critical areas. Each level can then try to reinforce these things or play with the expectations because of it. Let's take a look at one level and see how it tries to communicate. Wow, suddenly that's a lot of ships. Up until now, you've only seen 3 or 4, but this is suddenly a whole lot more. It's scary because you don't really have a deep understanding on the specifics of the queuing rules and the following rules, but then here this is. So players just say, let's just see what happens. And suddenly becomes a lot clearer. Just a few steps in, only one ship is really moving. So then the first turn command must go here, and the other two here and here, and yep, that looks like it's done. I like to think of this level as a bit of a prank, like jumping out of a cupboard and shouting boo. For an instant, it's a little scary, but when you realize what's happening, there's that burst of endorphins. But along with that, the level is also trying to teach you something, that you should always just see how the level plays out, and that might give you some clues on how to complete it. Also, it talks about the queuing rules being a lot more complicated, though whether those will be explored is not fully clear. Then there was this level. A lot of players were struggling with this level, and I wasn't able to understand why. It seemed simple enough to me and easy to deduce. Then I finally got it. Until now, along the main path, the solutions were not really based on deduction. They were more based on intuition. And this level really hints at a solution. That you have 4 commands and 4 places to place those commands. Surely that's a solution. And that's why it was not working out. It was in the wrong place. Context is an important factor within this concept. When the player is in a tutorial world, they are more receptive to the idea that they may yet have to find some mechanic. When they are in the main game, they should be confident that they have all the pieces and the game is just teaching them how to put them together. I actually had an issue where the players had a different understanding of what is an emergent interaction versus an explicit mechanic. There were 2 levels in the game that players felt cheated or unsatisfied. When I moved those levels into the tutorial stage, players were a little bit happier. There is still this level, which has a 50-50 ratio between being magical and feeling cheap, but you can't win every battle. So I started moving some levels into the optional star worlds. The star seems to wordlessly signal that it is an optional challenge world, and that works great. Here, players come in with a different context and are ready to forego some of the language that they have already learned and are ready to learn more different things. One more interesting point about context. In the final world, there was one level that a lot of players were getting stuck on. I was struggling to find out why that was. I didn't think there was a spike in difficulty there. But however, it turned out that just before that level, there is a serious story beat. If you've played the story, then you'll know the one I'm talking about. The intensity of that conversation is still fresh on the player's mind when they enter that level. So even though the difficulty is similar, the context of the player's mind space makes it a lot more difficult to solve. So I ended up simplifying that level in order to counteract the effects. One interesting thing in the game is this concept of notes. Notes are levels where the solutions are already laid out and the player just has to hit play. These are some of the most intricate and complex interactions I could find, and this concept allowed me to share them with the players. Different people treat them differently. Some try to figure out how the solution is going to work, some just play through them once, while others come back and step through and try to figure out exactly what happened. It also hints to the players that no solution in the game is going to be this complex. If there were solutions that were going to be this complex, then these notes would probably not exist. This concept of language also really helped me to understand how difficulty works in the game. Initially, it is easy to assume that adding more tokens and more ships makes a level more difficult, but I found that not to be the case. Often it leads to complexity explosion or just easy level breaks. Instead, difficulty is easier to measure by using one of these language concepts. We can increase the active area of the board. So now the player has to actually use deduction to figure out what is the correct interaction required to solve the level. Honestly, this whole concept of language only came to me very late in the game, very close to release. So I'm fully yet to understand it. Even formalizing it here like this has allowed me to gain a much deeper understanding, and I think I need to go back to the game and make some tweaks based on these learnings. The game also follows the story of a pirate startup and how their founders are hoping to make a big pitch to a pirate investor. I have found that the narrative of the game can be used to adjust the pacing. After a lot of puzzles and deep thinking, a light-hearted-ish story gives the chance for a player to breathe. Also, the story can help propel the player to want to complete the game. Here's a few things I learned. Keep the story simple. Having an overly complex storyline can just leave the player confused and uninterested. Keep each story beat short. If one beat goes on for too long, the player might just skip it, and once they skip one beat, it's likely that they'll skip the rest as well, and you lose whatever benefits you might have had. Figure out the spread. If the story is presented on a very regular basis, then it loses this ability to propel the player. The player's tolerance. At different points, the player will have different tolerances for the story. Right at the beginning, they are more likely to be patient. Similarly, right at the end, they are either fully invested or have stopped caring. Either way, you can add a lot more story here to keep things interesting. Achievements are similar as well. They are more valuable when they are a little rarer. I also used achievements to congratulate players for trying out different and unique things. If someone was playing around in what I felt was an interesting way, I tried to give them an achievement for that. Both of these tools can be used to improve the player's experience as long as they are used with the correct intent. At the end of it all, that's what it all boils down to. Being intentional about every aspect of your game. Try and see how everything impacts the player's experience and how can you craft things differently to shape the desired experience. You don't have to do these exact things. Rewinding the level probably doesn't help in your game. I just want you to think about what you're doing just because other games are doing it and whether you can change anything which might improve your game. The important thing is to be aware of all of these factors and whichever the ones which are relevant for you. I have more than 1,000 hours in KCPS, but I still don't think I fully properly understand some of these things. Sometimes it felt like I was thinking about all of this way too much. I'd gone too deep and it was all a waste of effort. But once the game came out, people seemed to enjoy it. And some people were also able to put a finger on why that was.
Oh, okay. That's cool that was like the only thing that kind of made sense to try to do, and it enabled us to learn the mechanics. So that's dope. Okay, so, oh, dude, it's so satisfying to get it like as soon as you see the level and then have it play out the right way. Man, that kind of level is really cool, right? Because you load in the fact that you have an intuition for how the mechanics work. It's like you discover that you have now intuited how the mechanics work. You know what I mean?
Needless to say, I don't think it was a waste anymore. I hope this has been helpful. I know that for me, it's often a random stray comment or off-topic discussion that triggers new insight into a way of looking into things that I'd never thought about before. And I hope that this has triggered some of those for you as well. If you found this interesting, you should join the Thinky Puzzle Game Discord. It is filled with people who are making and playing these kinds of games and are very interested in improving their craft. A lot of the ideas I presented came out of some insight triggered by some discussion there. There's a link in the description. If you're still here and you haven't played the game yet, hi. I hope this has convinced you to give it a shot. Konkan Coast Pirate Solutions is a cozy puzzle game about helping pirate ships do pirate things. It's out on Steam now. There's a link in the description. Cheers!